of the other things that you probably want to study before we get to your test on Mesopotamian Egypt is all of those Egyptian time periods, because we've got multiple kingdoms, we've got events that kind of, transition from one kingdom to the next, and it's not as complicated as some of the units are going to get with these events and keeping things in order. But you probably want to develop some techniques for making sure that you can do that and you can study effectively. So, one that I like to use, and if you ever look at my notes, this is how mine are set up for how we get from one thing to the next, is using what's called a flow chart. Mine are pretty basic. I tend to have each event in its own separate box, and then I'm going to connect those, and we'll look at what gets us from one time period to the next. Now, if this board was really long, I'd probably have them set up going across this way. Since it isn't, just so I have plenty of room to write, I'm going to go today straight down the page. Whichever way you want to set it up is fine. It's your test, and study the way that's best for you. Alright, so if we want to start with the Old Kingdom, which in Egypt would be the oldest period where we have solid written records, that would make sense. And the Old Kingdom you want to associate with the pyramids. The earliest pharaoh believed to have united Upper and Lower Egypt is Narmer, so we can put him actually right before the Old Kingdom. Early Egyptian dynasties would be Old Kingdom. Territory would be the smallest out of those maps that we looked at from the first cataract on the Nile going up. And the pharaohs in the Old Kingdom had a lot of power. So how do we get from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom? In other words, what's this arrow doing here? Now, if we want to pinpoint what happened, what we can say is, for this kind of between here, what's the transition, that we have some weak Old Kingdom pharaohs who are losing power. They regain power, take control over Egypt again much more solidly, and that gets us to the Middle Kingdom. So we have weak pharaohs, and then we have stronger government take back over. Strong government regains power. All right, and that takes us to the Middle Kingdom. During the Middle Kingdom, the territory expands a little bit further south. They add some farmland in the Delta region, which would be the northernmost part of Egypt, where it borders the Mediterranean Sea. So what happens with the Middle Kingdom? Well, they get invaded by the Hyksos, who come in from Asia. Okay? So, after the Middle Kingdom, what really marks the end of the Middle Kingdom is this invasion and takeover by the Hyksos. Okay? How do they do that? Remember that the Hyksos had chariots, and that's one of the reasons they're able to come in and conquer Egypt fairly easily, is the Egyptians don't have that. And the chariots are flexible enough in battle that it gives them an edge. So we have the Hyksos invade. With chariots. And that's a real key for them. Now, remember that while the Hyksos are in control of Egypt, the Hebrews come in from Canaan, and the Hebrews are under the Hyksos' protection, and the Egyptians are like, who are these people, and why are they here, and why do we have to listen to those guys, and they're not Egyptians, and nobody likes being conquered by somebody else. So over time, the resentment against the Hyksos becomes greater and greater, until finally the Egyptians rise up and they kick them out and they enslave the Hebrews. So if you're familiar with any of the Judeo-Christian history with the Old Testament and the Torah, this would be the period when the Hebrews become slaves in Egypt. It happens as they're kicking the Hyksos out. So, they kick the Hyksos out. Let's see. Okay. They enslave the Hebrews, which isn't a real big deal for us in terms of what we're studying with Egyptian history, but it will overlap when we talk about the Hebrews in a few weeks. So that is something that you want to remember. And I'm going to squish them in over here. All right. So after they get rid of the Hyksos, they take back over, and this is what leads us to the New Kingdom. Oh, look at that. All right. During the New Kingdom, we've got all those pharaohs that you need to study for the New Kingdom. I can put them out here out to the side, just so you don't forget. All right, let's see. We had Hatshepsut. And she was the female pharaoh who seized power. She was supposed to be ruling until her stepson was old enough, but she kind of took over the government. And then her stepson, Thutmose III, who's known as one of the most powerful and wealthy pharaohs. We also talked about Amenhotep IV, a.k.a. Akhenaten, the one who changed the religion to monotheism in order to try to control the priests, created a new capital city, and everybody hated him. Put him up here. And we know that his son was King Tut, who's remembered mainly because his tomb was found in 1922 unopened by Howard Carter. Tut, not a particularly significant New Kingdom pharaoh, but we put him in that time period too. And then the last one that you need to remember is Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, Egypt's greatest builder. And Ramses II was the one that signed that treaty with the Hittites, and they were allied for a few hundred years after that, so it's kind of a big deal. All right, so New Kingdom pharaohs, we have Egypt really building what we can call an empire, because not only are they going further south along the Nile, but they're also gaining territory all the way up along the eastern Mediterranean coast. So lots of territory, power, wealth, trade, all of that we associate with the New Kingdom. All right, so New Kingdom is great for several hundred years, but then they start becoming weaker again, and they get invaded by a group of people who are not really named in the historical record specifically. But the Egyptians kind of lump them together and call them collectively Sea Peoples. We don't know exactly who they are. We don't know exactly where they're from. Maybe the Philistines, but we're not positive. And with this weakening the Egyptians, they go into a decline. Later, they're going to be conquered by several different civilizations. The Persians are going to come in. Then they're going to be liberated from the Persians by Alexander the Great. The Greeks are going to be controlled. Then we're going to have problems with, some later conflicts with the Romans. So this is really the end of what we think of as, the mainstream of Egyptian history, that very solid rule by the pharaohs. And like I said, we'll come back to them with some other civilizations, but that's only because they can take it over. So flowchart's a very good way to keep things in sequence and to connect major events and major time periods.